You remember a world that had to be waited for. A song didn't start when you wanted it to. You waited for it on the radio. A conversation didn't arrive instantly. You called a house phone and hoped the right person picked up. Photos weren't taken endlessly. They were chosen, limited, developed later, sometimes forgotten in envelopes that lived quietly in drawers. And then, without asking you, the world changed. Suddenly, everything became immediate. Messages arrived instantly. Music was always available. Information stopped being something you searched for and became something that followed you. The pace of life shifted, and with it, something inside you had to shift too. If you were born somewhere in that narrow space between analog and digital, you didn't fully belong to either world. You learned patience before speed. You learned privacy before visibility. You learned how to exist without being constantly seen, and then you were slowly introduced to a world where being seen became almost expected. And if this feels like your experience, there may have been moments where you quietly wondered why you feel slightly out of place, even when everything around you seems normal. Not disconnected, not lost, just slightly misaligned. As if you were fluent in two emotional languages that don't always translate cleanly into each other. This is often where the hidden psychology of Xennials begins. Not in obvious differences, but in subtle internal contradictions that shape how you think, feel, and move through the world. And none of it means there is something wrong with you. It may simply mean you were shaped in a transition, and transitions rarely produce simple identities. Because part of you remembers a slower rhythm of life, a time when attention stayed in one place longer, when boredom existed without being immediately filled, when connection required effort, and that effort made it feel more deliberate, sometimes more meaningful. That version of you still exists. It shows up in the way you sometimes crave depth over speed, in the way constant notifications can feel intrusive rather than comforting, in the way silence doesn't always feel empty to you. But another part of you adapted to something very different, a world that rewards responsiveness, that moves quickly, that expects you to keep up with shifting trends, technologies, expectations of visibility and engagement, and you adapted well enough to function in it. But adaptation is not always the same as alignment, so you may find yourself living between two internal rhythms, one that wants to slow down and one that feels pressured to keep pace, one that values privacy and one that understands the currency of visibility, one that feels comfortable stepping back and one that quietly wonders if stepping back means falling behind. This internal tension can be difficult to explain, even to yourself, because from the outside it looks like you're doing fine. But inside, there's a constant negotiation happening between who you were shaped to be and what the world now seems to require. For many Xennials, this shows up in the way you relate to connection. You likely remember a time when friendships were built in physical spaces, long conversations that unfolded without interruption, time that stretched without being documented. And now, connection happens in fragments, messages instead of moments, reactions instead of responses, presence that is distributed across screens rather than shared in one place. You adapted to this. You learned how to stay connected in this new way. But sometimes it can feel like something is missing. Not in a dramatic sense, just a quiet absence. As if connection has become lighter, faster, but also slightly less anchored. And this can leave you in a strange position, able to engage, but not always feeling fulfilled by the engagement itself. Another layer appears in how you experience identity. You grew up during a time when identity was more contained. You could try things, fail, change, evolve without it being permanently visible, without every version of yourself being documented, shared, remembered by an audience. There was space to become. But now, identity often feels more fixed in public, more observed, more continuous, more exposed to interpretation. And even if you don't actively participate in that level of visibility, you are still aware of it. So part of you may feel cautious, Not because you're afraid of being seen, but because you remember what it felt like to exist without being constantly observed. And once you've known that kind of freedom, it can be difficult to fully relax in a world where observation feels continuous. There is also something quieter, something that often goes unnoticed. You learned independence early, not necessarily because you chose it, but because the environment encouraged it. Less supervision, more space, more responsibility for your own time, your own emotions, your own decisions. This created a kind of internal self-reliance, a sense that you can handle things on your own. And while this can look like strength, it can also create a subtle distance. Because when you are used to managing yourself, asking for support doesn't always come naturally. Not because you don't need it, but because your system learned not to expect it. So you may carry things quietly, process things internally, appear steady, even when something inside you feels unsettled. And over time, this can create a sense that you are slightly separate from others, even when you're connected to them. There's also the way you experience time itself. You remember a clear before and after, before everything sped up, before information became constant, before the boundaries between work, life, and rest became blurred. And because you remember that contrast, you may feel the acceleration of life more intensely than those who have only known one pace. You may feel tired in a way that is difficult to explain, not just physically, but mentally, as if your attention has been stretched across too many directions for too long. And yet, you continue, because you've learned how to adapt. But somewhere in that adaptation, a quiet question can emerge. Is this pace natural, or have I just learned to tolerate it? And then, somewhere in the middle of all this, something interesting happens. You begin to notice that you don't fully identify with the generations on either side of you. Too digitally fluent to feel completely disconnected, too analog-rooted to feel completely immersed. You understand both, but belong fully to neither. And this can create a subtle feeling of being in between, not lost, just unplaced. As if your experience doesn't have a clear category, even though it makes perfect sense when you feel it from the inside. And maybe this is where the deeper psychology reveals itself, because being shaped between two worlds often creates a heightened awareness. You see contrasts more clearly, you feel shifts more deeply, you notice what has been gained, but also what has been lost. And that awareness can be both a gift and a weight. It allows you to move between different ways of thinking, but it can also make it harder to feel fully settled in any one of them. At some point, this in-between space begins to shape how you see yourself, not in obvious ways, but gradually. You may start to define yourself through adaptability, through being the one who understands, who adjusts, who bridges gaps. And while this creates flexibility, it can also create a quiet question underneath it all. Where do I fully belong? But maybe belonging for you was never meant to look like a single place. Maybe it was always going to feel more like movement, like existing across spaces rather than inside just one. And that can feel uncertain at times, but it can hold a kind of depth that fixed identities don't always reach, because you have lived through contrast, and contrast changes the way you experience everything. It changes how you understand connection, how you relate to time, how you hold your identity, how you move through a world that doesn't always pause long enough to notice what it's becoming. And in all of this, your mind has been doing something very specific. It has been regulating, quietly, constantly, like someone adjusting the temperature between two climates, not letting yourself become too overwhelmed by speed, not letting yourself become too distant from it either. Balancing, calibrating, finding a way to exist between what was and what is. Sometimes this looks like stepping back. Sometimes it looks like engaging just enough. Sometimes it looks like needing more quiet than others seem to need. Not because something is wrong, but because your system has learned to carry two different worlds at once. And carrying two worlds requires a different kind of energy, a different kind of awareness, a different kind of care. So if you've ever felt slightly out of place, slightly between, slightly difficult to define, it may not be because you were unclear. It may be because you were shaped in a space that was never meant to be simple. You were shaped in a transition, and transitions don't produce clean edges. They produce depth. They produce complexity. They produce people who understand more than one way of being, even if that understanding sometimes comes with a quiet sense of not fully belonging anywhere. But maybe that was never a flaw. Maybe it was simply the shape of your experience. And maybe instead of needing to resolve that in-between feeling, you were always meant to carry it, not as confusion, but as a kind of quiet awareness, one that sees what others might not notice, one that feels what others might move past, one that holds both the past and the present without needing to choose between them. And maybe in that space, you were not lost at all. Maybe you were exactly where your experience has been leading you, right in the middle of understanding.